Winter. People don't notice whether it's winter or summer when they're happy. I remember when you told me that I had always been a smart kid. Then you said that, even when I was very young, I kept to myself most of the time. I've wondered whether you put those two thoughts together knowingly, since the day I picked up a book that you left open on the table and read the line, "Happiness in intelligent people is the rarest thing I know." I know I have your eyes, Mum, but you have to know this isn't your fault. I learned to speak early. My first words were, as usual, Mummy and Daddy. But my next word, instead of being hi or no, or any of the other things kids incessantly say, my third word was light. And I would reach my arms up to the lights on the kitchen ceiling, and I think I longed for its purity even then. My first memory is of me waking up in my baby seat and seeing you and Dad standing feet away. I stretch my arms towards you, and although I can't speak yet, you notice me there, Mum, and you already know what I want, like you always have. You pick me up and carry me over for the family photograph, hold me close, and everybody smiles. It seems fitting that my first memory is of taking a photograph, because it means that the first memory that ever froze in my mind was one that was frozen at the same time by film. A flash of white light that filled my eyes. I'm not sure whether it's a good thing to be able to remember so very far back, because remembering implies that you never forget. And I know, Mum, like I read in that book of yours, the detriment of thinking too much. It causes people to always look happier in photographs. It's not because you're a bad mother, Mum, that I wonder if you knowingly put those two thoughts together. It's not because the depression kept you in bed for days, and you had to tell me that you were sick. It's just that I wonder if you knowingly put them together, because I know I have. And I spray paint on that old building. I know I have lost. Childhood. Look round and round upon this bare bleak plain, and see, even here, upon a winter's day, how beautiful the shadows are. Alas, it is the nature of their kind to be so. The loveliest things in life are but shadows, and they come and go, and change and fade away as rapidly as these. We found it together one day, Imogen. Do you remember? That abandoned building deep in the forest behind our houses, when we were 5 years old. Its windows were boarded up, and the floor creaked as we stepped inside with hesitant, quiet feet. Our voices were hushed, as if we didn't want to wake the house. We walked slowly from room to room, side by side, knowing that it was ours. I had never seen you so silent as the day we first stepped inside that house, and I admit that I, too, gazed in wonder. I gaze in amazement still, but what strikes me now is our initial wonder, because it really is incredible the potential you can see in things when you're young. In that house we saw a fairy tale. The rooms were large and quiet, and a breeze swept through the hollow hallways, making your long brown hair dance and tangle around your face. You would cry later, when you returned home and your father combed out the knots. But when we were at that old abandoned house, we had not a care in the world. We would clasp hands and run down those empty halls as fast as our legs would carry us, laughing and shouting and flying in our own wondrous world. We spent years of our early life playing at that old house together. You picked flowers from the forest, and we tried to make the forlorn house beautiful, inviting as the enchanting world of stories. That was the world we wanted to see, and we were beginning to realize that the world needed our imagination to be as we wanted it. On its own, there wasn't anywhere we could understand wanting to be. And with our imagination, that building grew. I sometimes wish you had never told me the reason you liked to run away, that your father scared you when he came into your room at night and told you that you looked like your mum when she was young. Because if you'd never told me, I never would have told my mum. She would never have told yours, and you never would have left. Is it wrong to wish that, Imogen? Sometimes I think it is. Sometimes I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm sorry I don't know. We were 9 years old, and in my eyes, you were always the one who knew what was right. You left for Birmingham on my 10th birthday. I wouldn't let you see me break down as I stood there by the railroad tracks. I would never let you see me like that, because since the day that you told me about your father, I always felt that I needed to be the strong one for you. You always seemed so innocent still, and I wanted to be the person you could trust to keep you that way. I knew that you needed me, but I cried as your train disappeared from the station because I needed you too. You were the part of the world that made me happy. As I cried, I felt like a little kid again, remembering the day we found that abandoned house together, in a time that we were sure we could make a perfect world and keep it that way. I guess the real world always finds a way to break through. Why did you have to leave? Growing up. Wall heaped on wall, and battlement on battlement, the light was all withdrawn. The shining church turned cold and dark, the steam forgot to smile, the birds were silent, and the gloom of winter dwelt on everything. After Imogen left, I didn't go back to that abandoned house. I left its hallways to the gentle breeze and its rooms to the echoing stillness, and thus became another to contribute to its abandon. But with everything so changed, a sense of aimlessness, a lack of meaning, kicked in. Although I tried to forget the house, I thought about Imogen a great deal. I wondered if she was happy. I wondered if she was at least okay. I really hoped so. I tried to imagine what she did for fun up in Birmingham, away from the forests of the South, where wild ponies run free, and not so long ago, magic still seemed possible. I wondered whether she ever thought about me. I was sure she did, but as the years passed and we both grew up, I became less and less convinced. We each had a new group of friends, and while mine spoke with a Hampshire accent, hers spoke Brummie, and maybe by now she did too. Our lives were undeniably changed, and in the process, we had lost. She had been the only good thing in my life. She was the only source of innocence that came to mind when I thought about our decrepit world, its dirty streets where horrors beckoned from the alleyways, desperately in need of the money none of us had. She was as pure as that blinding light of my memory, and just as memorable. Too old for our years. I prefer winter and fall, when you feel the bone structure of the landscape, the loneliness of it, the dead feeling of winter. Something waits beneath it. The whole story doesn't show. My dad left my mum a year later. He went to join the toffs like him up in London, and soon I learned I had a baby brother that I would never see. My mum stayed in bed more than ever, and it broke my heart to hear her crying. I still climbed into bed with you some nights then when I had bad dreams. I'm not sure if you ever really lose the want to do that. It's just that most people say they grow out of it. But the truth was, Mum, the biggest reason I still did it was because I knew it would make you happy, and I knew you needed that. But sometimes I wondered, who was there for me? I know, Mum, that the group of friends I found in middle school weren't ones you approved of. They were the kids who threw spitwads from the back of the room and thought that talking back to the teacher was fun. But I told myself that you were just out of touch, and that you didn't understand what had to be done for solidarity these days. When Imogen left, I felt painfully alone, and getting into trouble was the first way I found to create a bond. Because as Oliver, Toby, James, and I sat in the headmaster's office, smirking at one another, I didn't feel so alone. The truth was, I couldn't figure out what else to do. They taught me how to skateboard, Oliver, Toby, and James, and I began to love it, because when I was skateboarding, I didn't think of anything else. When I told Oliver this, he said that was the point. I didn't want to think of home, where I can still hear the echo of Dad shouting, and we can barely pay the electricity bill. I didn't want to think about school, where all my teachers whispered, "Winter, such a shame. He had so much potential." I didn't want to think about thinking. I know the teachers used to say that I would publish a book one day, when they read what I wrote in my morning journals. I wrote pages and pages more when I got home until you made me stop to go to sleep. You told me that I was an artist, and that that was something special. I knew that I already had so many ideas in my head, but I just didn't know how to get them out. I didn't know how to write what I saw, and so nothing really came of any of it. But Oliver, James, and Toby let me believe that it didn't matter anyway, and so that worry for a time disappeared. And while blending in with them, the Winter I used to be, faded too. Imogen almost let me begin. She gave me the gift of images I wanted to paint. In my journal, I sketched a picture of the two of us flying, hand in hand, through the empty halls of that abandoned house, our cheeks red from running, our smiles joyful and innocent. I drew Imogen's tangled hair in a place where it was okay to leave it that way. The day you found my journal, Imogen, was one of the best days of my life. Because when I walked into the room and saw it open in your hands, my heart began to pound, but you walked over to me, smiled, and kissed me on the cheek. That scene plays in my mind sometimes even still, because although we were only 8 years old, in that moment I knew how important you would always be to me. You were the color in the black and white. Inspired, I painted the first words upon the wall of that abandoned building that day. I told you, "You are beautiful," and I meant it. Rebellion. In junior high, when my mates and I felt old enough to deny curfew, we roamed the streets at night, kicking the cobblestones with our boots and scouring the ground for half-smoked cigarettes that Oliver liked to pretend he needed. We stuffed our fists in our pockets against the cold and breathed smoke into the rainy night. We all tried to be older. But once we were, I couldn't think of a single good reason why. Maybe it's because we believed adults had more control over the world. The loss of innocence, suffering, suicide bombers, euthanasia, disaster, missing, fears, tragedies, fear, terror, paranoia, flood, Big Brother, horrific, fatal. When we were 15, we began to paint the streets. We shouted our frustration in angry color, and we imparted our thoughts in a desperate attempt to make the world wake up and notice what was happening to us. We weren't bad kids. We weren't. We had all always been smart. All of us had potential. And our anger and frustration was proof that we knew that. We felt that loss. The apathy we showed was merely our disguise for caring too much. We wrote and wrote and wrote, Oliver, Toby, James, and me. The streets became our canvas, spray paint our brushes. We lived through songs of punk bands like The Jam, and the desperation they shouted into microphones was our paint. There was thought in each stroke, and a life in each hopeless creation.
Go to work. Send your kids to school.
Think of this as a window.
Follow fashion. The pavement was our garden. Walk on the pavement. Real life is
Watch
here.
TV. Where are you?
Save for your old age. My future. Obey the law.
There?
All in all,
Repeat
you're just another brick in the
I
wall.
am free.
We Discordians must stick apart.
Blank Where did you
change
go?
the future.
Blank I miss you.
Do you know how badly we need saving? We're breathing paint out of plastic bags, and our mumbled mouths say, "Is anybody listening?"
When I was at home, I still filled my journals with pages and pages of words, but I knew that I could never show them to anyone. As I sat in my room, wrapped tightly in my jacket that was now too small, I wrote, and I thought about you, Imogen, and how supportive you always were of me. As I thought, I remembered what I wrote to you that day, on the wall of that house. You are beautiful. And the memory gave me an idea. I swept out of my house that night like the wind that tore at the windows, and stumbled through the pitch-black woods to that abandoned house. It was as you and I left it, old and decaying and beautiful. And for the first time in a long time, I saw the possibility of a renewal of hope that I hadn't found since you left. When Oliver, Toby, James, and I weren't roaming the streets, I again spent all of my time at that old house, trying to do the same as Imogen and I had tried so long ago, to create the world we wanted to see by relinquishing the old one. I started hesitantly at first, but over time I began to cover the walls with paint. I painted my life on those walls. The thoughts and fears, the happiness and love, the anger and frustration that my journals once bore covered those walls that had hidden quietly for so long. I painted partly in an attempt to prove to myself the artist in me that Mum saw long ago. I painted partly to recreate the color Imogen left. Winter's walls. The kids of my generation, like the generations before us, were being discarded without ever having a real chance. In the crucial time of our early years, we tried to turn the world around, but each line of graffiti on the streets became a prayer to a savior we were unable to believe in. The spirit of rebellion that we once brandished was slowly being extinguished, as we learned that nothing was, nor had ever been, expected of us except to fall into step. Only in chaos can we find true purpose. On the walls of that abandoned house, I shouted my heart out. I wrote and painted to the teachers who whispered, "What a shame," who believed, like everyone, that we would never amount to anything. Sing for the teachers who told you that you couldn't sing. I wrote to my father, who abandoned my mom and me, even when he was still around. Fuck you, Dad. I wrote to Imogen. She was a distant concept now more than anything. Proof to me of the idealism we felt and the beauty we found when the world was younger. Like I said, she was always the one who knew what was right, and I couldn't imagine her any other way. She reminded me that we once had hope. Hold me close. I love you. Like a bed of roses, there's a dozen reasons in this gun. I am not in any way afraid of death. You have nothing to lose. Find what you like and let it kill you. Nothing is static. Everything is evolving. Everything is falling apart. Forest martyrs. The white face of the winter day came sluggishly on, veiled in a frosty mist. And the shadowy ships in the river slowly changed to black substances. And the sun, blood red on the eastern marshes behind dark masts and yards, seemed filled with the ruins of a forest it had set on fire. I read Toby's name on the telly one morning. After Toby died in the explosion of bombs on the underground, new messages littered the streets. However, they were losing the confidence and air of resistance they once held. We were starting to wonder if change was impossible. We were giving up. Lies. Is this shit end war all over? James joined a band and moved to Liverpool, and I don't know if he ever heard about Toby. And by the time Oliver died of a heroin overdose, there was nobody left to write. We had become forced martyrs, and nobody knew our names. Darkness. One kind word can warm 3 winter months. I stood smoking in the corner of that crowded pub, gazing out at the dim room, when I saw you. Imogen, my childhood friend. I hadn't seen your face in 13 years, and I couldn't believe it. It was you. It was you. But it wasn't. You had the same tangled brown hair, and your cheeks were red, but this time it wasn't from running, but from alcohol. I guess that's running too. You laughed as you took the drink the man next to you offered, while he slipped his hands down your waist and then under your shirt. It doesn't mean anything that you laughed, though, because your face looked solemn like I've never seen it before. He took your drink and put it down, then moved his hand down to take hold of yours. I watched as he tilted his head to the doorway and began to lead you out of the room. After that, I couldn't stand to watch. You were the girl who smiled and brought bouquets of flowers from the forest. You were the girl who twirled in the center of the largest room of that old house, your hair whipping around your face and your joyful laughter echoing from the walls. You were color in the black and white. I could barely stand to see where you were now. You reached the door, and the man you were with pushed it ajar with a heavy hand. I ran over. I stopped beside you, and I didn't know what to say. My breath was ragged as I looked back and forth between you and him, with no idea what I could do. Finally, I just looked into your eyes and said, "You are beautiful, Imogen." Then I left. Light. I tore out of the pub into the night, stumbling blindly, first on the cobblestones, then into my backyard, then on the brush of the forest. I didn't stop until I reached that old house. Over the years, my life unfolded on the walls of that house. And as I stood in the center of the biggest room and turned slowly around, I read the story of my life. The hope, the confusion, the sadness, the anger, and the loss. I could barely distinguish where my character ended and the character of the abandoned house began. We were the same. I spun, slowly, and as I did I covered the walls with gasoline. The liquid merged with the paintings and soaked my skin. Then I lit the building afire. Like a phoenix, I hoped that, in some way, I could be reborn from the ash of my own destruction.